There are secrets hidden in old photographs that were never meant to be seen. When historians restored a wedding photo from 1911, they expected to find faded smiles and forgotten faces. Instead, they discovered something that shouldn't exist. The photograph showed a happy couple on their wedding day, surrounded by family and friends. But when the digital restoration was complete, someone noticed the shadows. There were figures standing in the darkness behind the wedding party. Figures that nobody remembered being there. And when they counted how many shadowy forms lurked in the background, they realized this wedding held a secret so dark it had been deliberately hidden for over a century. The discovery began in the spring of 2019 when Margaret Chen, a historical archivist at the Regional History Museum in Pennsylvania, received a donated collection of photographs from an estate sale. Among the dusty albums and loose prints was a large format wedding photograph, professionally taken in June of 1911. The image showed 12 people posed on the steps of a rural church. The bride and groom stood at the center, surrounded by family members in their finest clothes. The photo was badly damaged. Water stains had created dark blotches across the emulsion. Cracks ran through the faces of several subjects. Parts of the image had faded to a murky brown. Margaret decided the photograph deserved restoration. It was a beautiful example of early 20th century portrait photography, and the formal composition suggested the wedding had been an important social event in the community. She sent high-resolution scans to David Park, a digital restoration specialist who had worked with the museum on previous projects. David's job was to repair the damage digitally, enhancing details that time had obscured and removing the stains and scratches that made the photograph difficult to view. He began the painstaking work of cleaning up the image, pixel by pixel. He adjusted the contrast and brightness. He repaired the cracks in the emulsion. He carefully removed the water stains. As the photograph became clearer, David noticed something odd. Behind the wedding party, in the deep shadows cast by the church entrance, there appeared to be additional figures. At first, he assumed they were artifacts of the damage, perhaps patterns created by the water stains or irregularities in the old photographic paper. But as he continued to refine the image, the figures became more distinct. They had human shapes. They stood in a line, barely visible in the darkness of the church doorway. David counted them carefully. There were 7 shadowy forms, each one roughly the size and shape of a person. Their features were impossible to make out, but their postures suggested they were watching the wedding party. They stood perfectly still, unlike the posed subjects in the foreground. David felt a chill run down his spine. Something about these figures disturbed him. He called Margaret immediately and sent her the restored file. When she opened the image on her computer, she sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the shadows behind the bride and groom. Margaret's first instinct was to find out who these people were. She began researching the photograph's origins, trying to identify the wedding and the families involved. The estate sale records provided a name. The collection had belonged to the descendants of Thomas and Elizabeth Whitmore, married on June 17, 1911, in the small town of Ashford, Pennsylvania. Margaret drove to Ashford the following week. The town was barely more than a village with a population of less than 800 people. The church where the wedding had taken place still stood on Main Street, though it had been converted into a community center decades earlier. Margaret visited the local historical society, hoping to find records of the Whitmore wedding. An elderly volunteer named Ruth Patterson helped her search through boxes of old documents, newspapers, and family histories. They found a brief announcement of the wedding in the Ashford Weekly Gazette from June 1911. The article listed the names of the wedding party. The bride, Elizabeth Hartley, was the daughter of a local merchant. The groom, Thomas Whitmore, worked as a clerk at the town bank. The wedding party included Elizabeth's 2 sisters, Thomas's brother, and 8 other relatives and close friends. 12 people total, the exact number visible in the foreground of the photograph. Ruth frowned when Margaret showed her the restored image on her laptop. She leaned close to the screen, squinting at the shadowy figures in the background. She shook her head slowly and said she had never heard any stories about the Whitmore wedding being unusual or troubled. Margaret thanked Ruth and spent the rest of the afternoon photographing documents and copying records. She felt frustrated. The historical record confirmed what the photograph showed in the foreground but offered no explanation for the 7 additional figures lurking in the shadows. That evening, sitting in her motel room, Margaret began to wonder if there was something she was missing. She opened the restored photograph on her laptop and zoomed in on the shadowy forms. The more she looked at them, the more convinced she became that they were real people, not artifacts or tricks of light. Their positions were too deliberate. They formed a straight line, evenly spaced, as if they had been arranged for the photograph. But why would they stand in the shadows? Why weren't they mentioned in any of the records? Margaret decided to reach out to someone with expertise in photographic analysis. She contacted Professor Alan Rodriguez, a forensic photography expert at a nearby university. She explained the situation and sent him the original scan and the restored version. Alan agreed to examine the images and provide his professional opinion. 3 days later, he called Margaret with his findings. The shadowy figures were definitely present in the original photograph, he confirmed. They were not artifacts of damage or digital manipulation. They had been captured by the camera in 1911. But there was something strange about them. Alan had analyzed the lighting and shadows in the photograph using specialized software. The figures in the background appeared to be standing inside the church, in the doorway, where very little light would have reached them. Given the photographic technology of 1911, they should have been completely invisible, lost in the darkness. The fact that they were visible at all suggested they had been illuminated by some light source inside the church, but there was no evidence of any such light in the photograph. This discovery deepened the mystery. Margaret became obsessed with finding answers. She expanded her research, looking for any information about the Whitmore family and the events surrounding their wedding. She discovered that Thomas and Elizabeth had lived in Ashford for only 5 years after their marriage. In 1916, they had abruptly left town and moved to Ohio, where Thomas found work in a factory. They never returned to Ashford. Their departure had been sudden and unexplained according to local records. Margaret found this suspicious. Why would a couple abandon their hometown so quickly? She wondered if their departure was connected to the wedding photograph and its hidden figures. Margaret enlisted the help of Caroline Hayes, a genealogist who specialized in early 20th century Pennsylvania families. Caroline began tracing the Whitmore and Hartley family lines, looking for any unusual events or tragedies that might explain the mystery. What she discovered was disturbing. In the months following the Whitmore wedding, 7 people connected to the families had died under strange circumstances. Elizabeth's younger sister, Anna, had drowned in a river in August 1911, despite being a strong swimmer. Thomas's uncle had died in a house fire in September. 3 distant relatives had succumbed to a sudden illness in October that the local doctor could not diagnose. 2 family friends had died in separate accidents in November and December, 7 deaths in 6 months, all of them connected in some way to the bride and groom. Caroline showed Margaret her findings, and they both felt a growing sense of dread. The number was too significant to ignore. 7 deaths. 7 shadowy figures in the photograph. Margaret asked Caroline to find photographs of the 7 deceased individuals. Caroline searched through obituaries, family albums, and cemetery records. Within a week, she had collected portraits of all 7. Margaret laid the photographs out on her desk and compared them to the shadowy figures in the wedding photo. The body types and heights seemed to match. The postures were similar. Though the faces in the shadows were impossible to identify, Margaret felt certain she was looking at the same 7 people. But how could they appear in a photograph taken months before their deaths? Margaret shared her theory with David, the restoration specialist. He was skeptical at first, suggesting there might be a rational explanation. Perhaps the figures were wedding guests who happened to stand in the shadows, and their later deaths were simply a tragic coincidence. But Margaret pressed him to look more closely at the image. David spent hours analyzing the shadowy figures, zooming in on every detail. Finally, he called Margaret with a discovery that made her blood run cold. The figures were not standing naturally. Their feet did not appear to touch the ground. They seemed to be floating, suspended in the darkness. Their arms hung at odd angles, and their heads were tilted in ways that suggested they were not alive. David's voice trembled as he described what he saw. The figures looked like bodies, he said. Bodies hanging in the doorway of the church. Margaret felt sick. She could not shake the image from her mind. She returned to Ashford and went back to the Historical Society. She asked Ruth Patterson if there were any stories about deaths or tragedies connected to the church. Ruth thought for a moment and then remembered something. Her grandmother had once mentioned that the church had been the site of a terrible incident in the late 19th century. A fire had broken out during a service, and several people had died. The church had been rebuilt, but some of the older residents believed it was haunted. Ruth did not know the details. But she suggested Margaret check the church records, which were stored in the basement of the building. Margaret obtained permission to access the records. She spent an entire day searching through dusty ledgers and crumbling documents. She found what she was looking for in a journal kept by the church pastor in 1887. The entry was dated November 3rd. It described a fire that had started during an evening prayer service. 7 people had been trapped in the church and died from smoke inhalation. Their bodies had been found in the doorway, where they had tried to escape. The pastor had written about the grief and horror that had gripped the community. He had also written something else, something that made Margaret's hands shake as she read it. He wrote that in the weeks following the fire, members of the congregation had reported seeing the 7 victims in the church. They appeared as shadows, standing in the doorway, watching the services. The pastor had dismissed these reports as grief and imagination, but the sightings continued for months. Margaret photographed the journal pages and left the church. She sat in her car, trying to process what she had learned. The 7 figures in the wedding photograph were the victims of the 1887 fire. They had appeared in the background of the image, just as they had reportedly appeared to churchgoers over the years. But why had they shown up in this particular photograph? Margaret thought about the 7 deaths that had followed the wedding. She wondered if there was a connection, a pattern she was missing. She called Caroline and asked her to investigate the church fire victims. Caroline worked quickly. Within 2 days, she had identified all 7 people who had died in the fire. She sent Margaret their names and photographs. Margaret compared the fire victims to the people who had died after the wedding. There was no direct family connection, but she noticed something else. Each of the 7 people who had died after the wedding had been born in the same years as the fire victims. Anna, Elizabeth's sister, had been born in 1892, exactly 5 years after the fire. The other 6 deaths also corresponded to the ages of the fire victims. It was as if history was repeating itself, as if the dead were claiming new lives to replace their own. Margaret felt a terrible weight settle over her. She believed she had uncovered the truth, but it was a truth that defied rational explanation. She decided to contact Thomas and Elizabeth Whitmore's descendants to see if they knew anything about the photograph or the events of 1911. She found a grandson living in Ohio, an elderly man named Robert Whitmore. She called him and explained her research. Robert was silent for a long time after she finished speaking. Then he told her a story his grandmother, Elizabeth, had shared with him when he was a child. Elizabeth had said that on her wedding day, she had felt a presence in the church. She had seen shadows moving in the doorway behind the altar. She had been terrified, but had said nothing, not wanting to ruin the ceremony. After the wedding, she had nightmares about the shadows. When people close to her began to die, she became convinced that the shadows had been a warning, or a curse. She had begged Thomas to leave Ashford, and he had agreed. They had never spoken about the wedding or the deaths again. Robert's voice was heavy with emotion as he told Margaret that his grandmother had died believing she had brought a curse upon her family. Margaret felt a deep sadness for Elizabeth Whitmore. She thanked Robert and ended the call. She sat in her office looking at the restored photograph on her computer screen. The bride and groom smiled at the camera, unaware of the darkness that surrounded them. The 7 shadowy figures stood in the background, silent witnesses to a tragedy that had not yet occurred. Margaret knew she could not prove what had happened. She could not explain why the dead had appeared in the photograph, or why 7 people had died in the months that followed, but she believed the photograph had captured something real, something beyond the ordinary boundaries of life and death. Margaret wrote a detailed report about her investigation. She included all the historical records, the genealogical research, and the forensic analysis of the photograph. She submitted the report to the museum director, who read it with a mixture of fascination and disbelief. The director decided not to display the photograph publicly, fearing it would attract unwanted attention or distress the families involved. The image was archived in the museum's collection, accessible only to researchers with special permission. Margaret kept a copy of the restored photograph on her computer. She looked at it sometimes, late at night when the office was quiet. She thought about Elizabeth Whitmore and the fear she must have felt. She thought about the 7 people who had died, and the 7 victims of the fire who had never truly left the church. Years later, Margaret received an email from a researcher in New York who had heard about the photograph. The researcher had been investigating similar cases of anomalous figures appearing in historical photographs. She sent Margaret examples from her own collection. In each case, shadowy forms had appeared in the background of images taken at weddings, funerals, and other significant events. In each case, unexplained deaths or tragedies had followed. The researcher believed these photographs captured moments when the boundary between the living and the dead became thin, when past and present overlapped. Margaret read the email with a mixture of relief and dread. Relief that she was not alone in what she had discovered. Dread that the phenomenon was more widespread than she had imagined. The 1911 wedding photograph remains one of the most disturbing pieces of evidence that some events leave marks on the world that cameras can capture. The 7 figures in the shadows serve as a reminder that history is not always what it seems, and that the dead do not always rest quietly. Elizabeth and Thomas Whitmore carried the weight of that knowledge for the rest of their lives, and now, more than a century later, we carry it too. The photograph asks us to consider what lies beyond the edges of our understanding, what shadows we might be standing in without realizing it. So the next time you look at an old photograph, pay attention to the background. Look at the shadows. Count the figures. You might discover that there are more people in the image than there should be, and if you do, remember the Whitmore wedding. Remember that some secrets are hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. If you found this story as chilling as we did, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more mysteries from history. Drop a comment below and let us know what time and country you're watching from. Until next time, stay curious and maybe keep the lights on.